"Are you sure you're in the right place?" The receptionist's words hit Emma like a slap, but she kept her composure. "Yes, I have an interview with Mr. Blackwell," she replied, her voice steady. The receptionist's eyes scanned her from head to toe. Worn blazer, frayed bag, scuffed sneakers. Her polite smile turned tighter. "Take a seat," she said curtly, motioning toward a row of chairs. Emma sat down, clutching her portfolio. Around her, the waiting area buzzed with quiet conversations. The other candidates, polished, confident, wrapped in expensive suits, barely spared her a glance except for the occasional raised eyebrow or smirk. "She doesn't stand a chance," one whispered, not bothering to keep his voice low. Emma heard them, but she didn't react. She was used to it. People had been judging her for as long as she could remember, judging her for not looking the part, for not fitting their idea of what success should look like. But she wasn't here for their approval. She was here because she believed in her ideas. She believed that talent and determination mattered more than appearances. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. When her name was finally called, she took a deep breath, stood tall, and walked toward the large double doors leading to the conference room. Inside, Mr. Blackwell waited. He was everything Emma had imagined. Sharp suit, piercing gaze, an air of authority that filled the room. He glanced up as she entered, his eyes narrowing slightly at her attire, but he didn't say a word. "Miss Carter," he greeted, standing to shake her hand. "Mr. Blackwell," she replied firmly, meeting his gaze. The interview began. Emma spoke with passion and confidence, presenting her ideas with precision. She outlined bold strategies, innovative concepts, and detailed plans to solve real-world problems. Her portfolio, filled with months of hard work, was passed across the table. Mr. Blackwell listened, but his occasional glances at her sneakers or the frayed edges of her blazer didn't go unnoticed. Emma felt it, the subtle weight of judgment, the unspoken question, "Can someone who looks like this really belong here?" When the interview ended, Mr. Blackwell leaned back in his chair. "Thank you for your time, Miss Carter. We'll be in touch," he said, his tone polite but distant. Emma nodded and walked out of the room, her head high despite the knot forming in her stomach. As she stepped outside, the cool air hit her face, and a single thought played over and over in her mind. Did they even hear me? Or did they just see my shoes? Oh, what Emma didn't know was that her story wasn't over. What would happen next would leave Mr. Blackwell and everyone else completely stunned. The towering edifice of Blackwell Enterprises loomed over the city, its glass facade shimmering like a mirror against the bright morning sky. Emma stood on the sidewalk, her gaze fixed on the building's sleek lines and imposing height. The structure seemed to command respect, a silent guardian of ambition and power. Around her, the buzz of the city continued, indifferent to her pounding heart. Pedestrians rushed past, their polished shoes clicking against the pavement while taxis honked in the distance. She adjusted the strap of her leather bag, its once pristine surface now worn and frayed at the edges. Her faded blazer felt like an apology against the backdrop of sleek business suits that brushed past her. She glanced down at her shoes. Scuffed but sturdy, they had carried her through more struggles than she cared to admit. "This is it," she muttered under her breath, trying to steady her nerves. "This is your chance." Taking a deep breath, Emma pushed back her doubts. The late nights, the revisions, the sacrifices, they all led to this moment. She clutched her portfolio tightly, the sharp edges of its corners pressing into her palms. Inside were pages of ideas, meticulously crafted strategies, and bold innovations she had poured her soul into. The revolving doors of Blackwell Enterprises turned smoothly, beckoning her inside. She hesitated, watching the doors spin as though they were a test of her resolve. Beyond them lay the opportunity she had fought so hard for, but also judgment. The world she was stepping into wasn't forgiving, especially not to those who didn't look the part. Emma squared her shoulders, pushing aside the unease gnawing at her. "You don't need to belong here," she told herself. "You just need them to see what you're capable of." She stepped forward, her reflection briefly merging with the city's skyline in the glass before disappearing inside. The cool air of the lobby enveloped her, a stark contrast to the warm, bustling streets outside. The space exuded sophistication. Marble floors stretched out beneath her, reflecting the soft glow of modern chandeliers. The scent of polished wood and expensive cologne lingered in the air, completing the ambiance of wealth and precision. Emma's steps faltered as she took in the scene. Around her, executives moved with quiet purpose, their tailored suits and confident strides amplifying her awareness of her own frayed edges. Conversations hummed, a symphony of power plays and decision-making. She tightened her grip on her portfolio and inhaled deeply, letting the air steady her resolve. No one here knew her story, the sleepless nights, the relentless determination, the quiet sacrifices. This wasn't about them. This was about proving to herself that she could rise above their judgment. Her eyes locked on the reception desk at the far end of the room. Straightening her posture, Emma began her walk toward it, each step an act of defiance against the doubts threatening to consume her. Emma's journey to the reception desk would set the tone for her interactions inside Blackwell Enterprises, where she would encounter characters who would test her resolve and perceptions in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Emma approached the sleek black reception desk, her steps steady but deliberate. Behind the desk, Sarah, the receptionist, glanced up briefly, her expression a polished mask of professionalism. Her sharp gaze swept over Emma, pausing ever so slightly on her scuffed shoes and frayed blazer before flicking back to the monitor in front of her. "Name?" Sarah asked curtly, her tone clipped. "Emma Carter," Emma replied, keeping her voice even despite the faint tightness in her chest. Sarah typed for a moment, the sound of her manicured nails clicking against the keyboard filling the silence. "You're here for the interview with Mr. Blackwell?" she said, her tone light but tinged with something Emma couldn't quite place. "Yes," Emma answered, gripping the edge of her portfolio. "Take a seat," Sarah said, gesturing to a row of modern chairs against the wall. Her smile was polite but distant, as though she had already made up her mind about Emma. Emma nodded and turned toward the waiting area. The chairs were sleek and minimalist, more about aesthetic than comfort. She chose the one furthest from the others, conscious of the judgmental glances she could feel from the polished candidates scattered across the room. It was then she noticed Sophia. Sophia, a young assistant with her brown hair tied in a loose ponytail, was weaving through the waiting area. She carried a clipboard, her steps quick and purposeful, yet there was a softness to her demeanor that set her apart from the rest of the corporate atmosphere. Unlike others, her movements didn't carry the air of superiority or judgment. Emma's eyes met Sophia's as the young woman approached. Unlike the fleeting, assessing glances she had received all morning, Sophia's gaze lingered, not on her worn shoes or faded blazer, but on the portfolio clutched in her hands. Her expression was one of curiosity, not disdain. "You're up next," Sophia said gently, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow it cut through the thick tension that hung in the air. She smiled, a small but genuine gesture that reached her eyes. Emma blinked, surprised by the warmth in her tone. "Thank you," she murmured, her fingers unconsciously tightening their hold on the portfolio. Sophia hesitated for a moment before adding, "Good luck." The sincerity in her words felt like a lifeline amidst the sea of judgment that surrounded Emma. Emma watched as Sophia walked away, weaving back toward the reception desk. She could see the subtle difference in how Sophia treated everyone. Polite, attentive, but never condescending. From across the room, another candidate in a sharp navy suit leaned toward his companion. "She's definitely not getting the job," he whispered, his voice just loud enough for Emma to hear. The woman next to him chuckled softly, glancing briefly in Emma's direction. Emma ignored them, focusing instead on the clipboard Sophia had been holding and the warmth of her words. As Emma waited, the subtle encouragement from Sophia lingered in her mind, providing a sliver of reassurance in an otherwise cold and unwelcoming environment. Little did she know, her interactions with Sophia would play a pivotal role in what was to come. Emma sat quietly in the waiting area, her portfolio balanced on her lap. She flipped through its pages, a subconscious attempt to focus on something tangible amid the storm of whispers and sideways glances. Across the room, two candidates in sharp suits leaned toward each other, their voices low, but not low enough. "Did you see her shoes?" the man said, his tone dripping with amusement. The woman beside him suppressed a laugh, glancing briefly in Emma's direction. "She's not even trying to fit in. What's she doing here?" Emma pretended not to hear, though their words tightened her chest like a vice. She kept her gaze fixed on her portfolio, her fingers tracing the edges of a chart she had spent countless hours perfecting. Sarah, the receptionist, leaned across her desk to speak to a colleague. Emma caught snippets of their conversation. "She's here for Mr. Blackwell's interview," Sarah said, tilting her head slightly toward Emma. "Her?" the other woman asked, disbelief evident in her voice. Sarah shrugged, her tone indifferent. "Maybe it's charity work." Emma's grip on her portfolio tightened further, her knuckles whitening. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to focus on the work in front of her rather than the constant reminders of how out of place she looked. Sophia approached again, clipboard in hand. The assistant moved through the room with her usual calm efficiency, her ponytail swaying slightly as she walked. This time she stopped beside Emma's chair. "You're next, Miss Carter," Sophia said softly. Emma looked up, startled by the kindness in her tone. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but quiet. Sophia hesitated, then added, "You'll do great." She smiled again, the kind of smile that reached her eyes, and for a brief moment Emma felt seen. Not judged, not dismissed, but acknowledged. The warmth of Sophia's words lingered as Emma stood, her portfolio held firmly in her hands. She caught the eye of one of the candidates who had whispered about her earlier. He smirked, clearly amused by her apparent confidence. As Emma walked toward the large double doors leading to the interview room, the tension in the waiting area seemed to follow her. Conversations paused, and she felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on her back. Even Sarah's polite indifference now felt sharper, her gaze trailing after Emma like a shadow. Sophia opened the door for her, offering one last reassuring nod before stepping aside. Emma entered the room, her steps deliberate and measured. The interview room was as imposing as she had imagined. Its floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in natural light, while abstract art pieces adorned the walls. At the far end of the polished mahogany table sat Mr. Blackwell, his presence commanding and intimidating all at once. As Emma approached, Mr. Blackwell's gaze swept over her, pausing briefly on her shoes and blazer before meeting her eyes. He stood, extending a hand. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "Mr. Blackwell," Emma replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing toward the chair opposite him. Emma sat down, placing her portfolio on the table. She could feel his eyes on her, assessing, measuring. His expression gave nothing away, but Emma could sense the subtle undercurrent of doubt. Back in the waiting area, the candidates resumed their whispered conversations, their curiosity about Emma now mixed with judgment. "Do you think she even has a chance?" one of them asked, his voice laced with skepticism. The woman beside him shrugged. "Not looking like that, she doesn't." Sophia, who had returned to her desk, overheard their exchange. She shot them a glance, not harsh, but pointed enough to silence their remarks. Her quiet presence seemed to convey a silent message. Appearances didn't define capability. Inside the interview room, Emma began her presentation. She spoke with clarity and conviction, her passion evident in every word. Yet she couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in Mr. Blackwell's expression as he listened. His gaze occasionally flicked back to her attire, as though trying to reconcile the quality of her ideas with the way she looked. While the judgment and assumptions around Emma continued to build tension, her determination and resilience hinted at an impending moment that would challenge these biases and redefine perceptions in unexpected ways. Emma stood in the conference room, her hands gripping the edges of her portfolio as though it were the only thing grounding her. The air felt heavier now, charged with the quiet murmurs of anticipation and judgment. Every set of eyes in the room seemed to be on her, some curious, some critical. The faint hum of the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows felt distant, as though this moment had closed in on itself, leaving her in the spotlight. Across the polished mahogany table, Mr. Blackwell sat with his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over her one more time, from her scuffed shoes to her frayed blazer. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the faint rustle of papers from one of the assistants in the corner. "Miss Carter," he said at last, his voice low but commanding. "You may proceed." Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound almost deafening in her ears. She opened her portfolio with trembling fingers, the smooth pages brushing against her skin as she flipped to the first page. This was it, the moment she had been working toward, the moment they would see her ideas for what they truly were, beyond the surface. Before she could begin, the whispers started. From the back of the room, a man in a tailored navy suit leaned toward his colleague, his voice low but audible. "Is she really going to make a case dressed like that?" he muttered, his tone dripping with skepticism. The woman beside him smirked, her manicured fingers tapping against the table. "It's almost admirable, really," she said softly, her words laced with condescension. "Almost." Emma's grip on her portfolio tightened, her knuckles white against the dark leather. She refused to look up, to give them the satisfaction of knowing their words had landed. Instead, she took a deep breath and steadied herself. From the corner of the room, Sophia, the young assistant who had shown her kindness earlier, caught Emma's eye. She gave a small, encouraging nod, her expression calm and steady. It was a lifeline, however faint, in the sea of judgment surrounding Emma. Mr. Blackwell cleared his throat, drawing the attention back to himself. He leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze never leaving Emma. "Whenever you're ready, Miss Carter," he said, his tone neutral but heavy with expectation. Emma exhaled slowly, her voice steady as she spoke her first words. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell," she began, lifting her gaze to meet his. "Let me show you why I deserve to be here." The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. All eyes were on Emma, waiting for what she would say next. As Emma began her presentation, the weight of every judgment, every whisper, and every glance followed her words, setting the stage for a moment that would redefine everything. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the city below. Emma stood at the head of the table, her portfolio open in front of her. Her fingers brushed against the first page, her voice steady as she spoke. "I didn't come here to fit into anyone's mold," she began, her eyes meeting Mr. Blackwell's unyielding gaze. "I came here because I believe in my ideas, and I believe they can create real change." She turned the portfolio around, revealing the first page of meticulously crafted charts and strategies. The room shifted subtly. People leaned forward, their curiosity piqued despite themselves. "These," she continued, pointing to the data before her, "are the numbers behind the problem your company faces. And these—" She flipped to the next page, her confidence growing with each word. "Are the solutions I've developed. They're bold, they're unconventional, but they work." Mr. Blackwell's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes lingered on the data longer than they had on her shoes or blazer. Across the table, a man who had previously whispered disparaging comments sat straighter, his smirk fading as he studied her work. Sophia, standing quietly at the back of the room, smiled faintly. Her encouragement from earlier now felt validated. She had seen something in Emma that the others had overlooked, something that was now impossible to ignore. The woman who had sneered in the waiting area crossed her arms, her brow furrowing as she scanned the presentation. "She's actually onto something," she murmured to her colleague, disbelief softening her tone. Emma continued, her voice unwavering. "I know I don't look like the people you usually see in this room," she said, her gaze sweeping the table. "But innovation doesn't come in a uniform. It comes from seeing the world differently and being brave enough to act on those visions." Finally, Mr. Blackwell leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His piercing gaze met Emma's, and for the first time, a flicker of respect crossed his features. "This is unexpected," he said, his voice thoughtful, "but undeniably impressive." Gasps rippled through the room, subtle but audible. The weight of Mr. Blackwell's words hung in the air, their significance sinking into the minds of everyone present. Sophia's face lit up, her smile broadening. Meanwhile, those who had judged Emma so harshly earlier now wore expressions of quiet embarrassment, their glances darting toward one another as if seeking reassurance. Emma stood a little taller, the doubts and whispers that had once seemed so loud now fading into the background. She closed her portfolio, her hands steady. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but filled with quiet triumph. As she looked around the room, she saw not just the faces of those who had doubted her, but also the spark of realization in their eyes. She had done more than present a solution. She had challenged their perceptions and emerged victorious. With the reveal complete, Emma had not only proven herself but also left a lasting impact on everyone in the room, setting the stage for an emotional and reflective conclusion. The weight of the moment settled over Emma as she closed her portfolio. Her chest heaved slightly, the adrenaline from the presentation slowly ebbing away. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to sit still, to process what had just happened. Across the room, Mr. Blackwell's final words lingered in her mind. "This is undeniably impressive." A validation she had longed for, but never expected to hear. Her hands rested on the smooth leather of her portfolio, fingers brushing its edges as if grounding herself in its tangible presence. The earlier whispers of doubt and judgment that had buzzed around her now faded into a different kind of silence. A silence of realization, admiration, and perhaps guilt. Emma dared to lift her gaze and look around the room. The candidates who had once smirked and whispered behind her back now avoided eye contact. Their confident postures had softened into something more subdued. The man in the navy suit, who had earlier mocked her appearance, seemed to hesitate before walking toward her. His stride lacked the arrogance he had displayed earlier, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter, almost unsure. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone lacking its previous sharpness, "you were incredible in there. Your presentation was something else." Emma looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she extended her hand, meeting his halfway. "Thank you," she replied, her tone neutral but polite. She wasn't one to hold grudges, but she wasn't about to forget the weight of his earlier judgment either. At the other end of the table, the woman in the crisp white blouse exchanged a glance with her colleague. "I didn't expect that," she murmured, leaning closer. Her voice carried neither malice nor mockery, only genuine surprise. Meanwhile, Mr. Blackwell remained seated, his gaze fixed on Emma as if seeing her for the first time. His previously impenetrable expression had softened, just slightly. "Miss Carter," he said, "you've given us much to think about." Sophia, standing near the doorway, couldn't hide her smile. Her hands were clasped around a clipboard, but her eyes were fixed on Emma. "I knew it," she said softly as Emma approached. "I knew you'd blow them away." Emma smiled back, her earlier nerves now replaced by a quiet confidence. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Sophia's words and actions had been a beacon of kindness throughout the day, and they meant more to Emma than she could say. As the other candidates slowly gathered their belongings, their subdued manner spoke volumes. The air of superiority that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by something more introspective. Even Sarah, the receptionist who had been so dismissive earlier, seemed different. As Emma passed her desk on the way out, Sarah stood up and offered a small, genuine smile. "Congratulations, Miss Carter," she said, her voice sincere. Emma paused, her surprise evident. "Thank you," she replied, nodding slightly before continuing toward the lobby. The energy outside the building felt entirely different. The sun had begun its descent, casting warm golden hues across the glass facade of Blackwell Enterprises. Emma stood for a moment at the edge of the sidewalk, her portfolio tucked under her arm. She looked down at her shoes, the same scuffed, worn pair that had drawn so much scrutiny earlier. They hadn't changed, but something within her had. Her shoulders were straighter, her steps lighter, her heart more assured. She thought back to the journey that had brought her here, the late nights, the sacrifices, the self-doubt. And yet, here she stood, not defined by the whispers or the glances, but by the work she had carried into that room and the courage it took to present it. In her mind, she reflected on the lessons of the day. It wasn't just about proving herself, it was about challenging perceptions, her own and others. As she walked down the busy street, she smiled softly, the noise of the city blending into a hum around her. The reflections from that day weren't confined to the walls of Blackwell Enterprises. They would ripple outward, leaving lasting lessons for everyone who had been a part of it, including Emma herself. As Emma walked down the bustling street, the city seemed different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The scuffed shoes that had been the subject of whispers and judgment that morning now carried her with purpose. Each step echoed the quiet defiance she had shown in that gleaming boardroom, a defiance that had demanded to be seen for her ideas, not her appearance. Emma's journey had proven more than just her professional worth. It had forced those around her to confront their own biases and assumptions. Mr. Blackwell, so often regarded as an unflinching arbiter of competence, had been compelled to reconsider what success could look like. The candidates, once full of quiet scorn, had left the room subdued, their confidence chipped away by the realization that they had underestimated someone who refused to conform to their expectations. Her quiet courage had not only earned respect but had ignited a ripple effect. It was a reminder that in a world where appearances often overshadow substance, the strength to remain authentic could be a revolutionary act. Emma paused at the corner of the street, the setting sun casting a warm, golden glow on the towering glass facade of Blackwell Enterprises. She clutched her portfolio tightly, not as a crutch, but as a symbol of everything she had fought for. The weight of self-doubt and external judgment that had pressed down on her all day now seemed lighter, almost inconsequential. For the first time, she allowed herself to reflect on the whispers and glances she had endured. They no longer stung. Instead, they served as proof of how far she had come. Her journey hadn't just been about proving her worth to others, it had been about proving it to herself. And in that moment, she realized something profound. The whispers, the smirks, the doubts, they had never mattered. What mattered was that she had believed in her own voice, her own ideas, and had found the courage to share them. Emma smiled to herself, the kind of smile born not from pride, but from peace. She had shown them, and herself, that resilience wasn't just about enduring challenges, but about standing tall in the face of doubt. She hadn't just survived the day. She had transformed it into something meaningful. As she stepped forward, blending into the rhythm of the city, Emma thought of all the others who might face similar challenges. Those judged by their shoes, their clothes, their background, rather than their brilliance. She hoped her story would remind them of this truth. True worth isn't found in the superficial. It shines through resilience, courage, and authenticity. Her story wasn't just her own. It was for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. It was a testament to the power of staying true to oneself, even when the world demanded otherwise. If Emma's story resonated with you, let it be a reminder of the power of authenticity and courage. In a world quick to judge, let's choose empathy and kindness instead. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and voices matter, and we'd love to hear them. Emma's steps carried her forward, her journey far from over. But as the city lights began to glow around her, she knew one thing for certain. The day she had faced wasn't just a challenge, it was the beginning of something extraordinary.